And then we followed with the one on Mau Mau, where we had our friend from the University of Warwick, Niels, who spoke to us on Mau Mau. Today, we want to continue this series, and we are going to look at the theme entitled Racial Thinking in Mombasa, Kenya. Our presenter this Nairobi afternoon is one of our own students, Ngala Chome. Wana Chome, welcome home, because you were our undergraduate student many years back. And I'll say, Ngala, you have done extremely well. And we are very proud of you. And quite a couple of your classmates really coming up very well. And for those of us here who actually saw you as a young man, we are very proud of you because of where we are. And we look forward, and I will boldly say we look forward to seeing you joining the department as one of us. And I'm saying that with a lot of confidence. So without much ado, I will now have the pleasure to welcome you to speak to us.
Thank you, Molim. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not sure how long I have. I could just. Okay. All right. So the work that I'm going to present today comes off of my PhD research, which I've been working on. Well, since I can say even I can give it a decade actually, since I started thinking about these questions that ended up informing my PhD research, but formally about 5 years now. And today I was just intimating to Mwalimu Gona that this will be the first time actually talking about my PhD in a public forum. So a lot of it is going to be kind of sharing my arguments, why I ended up with those arguments, my conclusions, and a little bit of the empirical evidence that I was able to gather while doing the research. I really became obsessed with this idea of racial thinking and racial thought. I mean, generally, the interest here is, my interest was in identity politics, and I chose that term deliberately to talk about how politics in the continent of Africa, thinking about like how African people have imagined identity within African politics, and the main argument was ethnicity in particular. Throughout African studies, the African studies in literature, ethnicity, there's been an emphasis on ethnicity as the main sort of language through which people talk about political competition, but also ideas about moral debates about civic virtue and morality. We know all these arguments postulated by the John Lonsdales, the Mahmoud Mamdanis. But I decided to take a different angle, in particular looking at how identity has been imagined in Mombasa throughout time, and in this case, discovering or examining what in the paper I refer to as a localized racial discourse that has been fundamental to the imagination of the residents and officials of the city across time, but also has been central in debates about struggles for status, rights, and resources, but also in moral debates about civic virtue, and also sort of ties that people have with each other. So race or racial thinking has been at the center of social and political imagination of residents and officials in the Kenyan coastal town of Mombasa since at least the second half of the 19th century, which is what my PhD shows. In Mombasa and elsewhere along the Kenyan coast, racial thought has provided the battleground between, for instance, maritime and continental imaginaries, which I will explain, Islamic and non-Islamic traditions, civilization, quote unquote, and barbarism, and whatever that means. Racial thought has really been at the center of this kind of imaginaries and has come to assume a central place in debates regarding what constitutes proper civic and personal virtue. In Mombasa, racial modes of thought have provided frames of reference through which people identify themselves against others. And these have influenced the distribution of status, rights, and resources, and have shaped political action and moral debate. In particular, in moments where the future political direction of Mombasa has been dramatically put into question, and when new political possibilities suddenly open out, authorizing debate over the fundamentals of Mombasa's identity and its future, race has also informed public debates on citizenship that have often been acrimonious and bitter, and which are often than not, more often than not, couched in a distinctive language of racial antagonism. And there are many, many kind of examples where this has happened. In particular, during the decolonization decade of the 1950s, for those who know about the Mwambao movement, you would see this kind of emergence of a racial language in political debate during that time. This is also repeated in the 60s and 70s, but also in the 90s after the return to multi-party politics. Yet, much writing and inquiry about society and the politics of Mombasa, and about African politics more widely, has continued to emphasize ethnicity, which is often presented as the dominant language, not only for political competition, but also for conducting moral debates about civic and personal virtue. Now, I have to make this point before I proceed, that I'm not dismissing the rich historiography of ethnic politics, either in Mombasa, Kenya, or Africa more widely. In fact, the literature on African ethnicity is germane to this discussion in two main ways. First, in its explanation of the moral economy of ethnicity, or what John Lonsdale has called political, in its explanation of ethnic competition, or what John Lonsdale has called political tribalism, and in its examination of the moral economy of ethnicity, or moral ethnicity, again, a concept derived from Lonsdale's work. Now, these two contrasting uses, if you like, of ethnic identity in Africa, and here I'm borrowing Peter Eke's characterization, where ethnic identity is one used in strategies of political competition with the imagined other, and at the same time, provides the ideological resources for conducting moral discourses. These are also features of racial thinking in Mombasa. So following from this, my study and this presentation is basically an examination of the political and moral uses of race, and of the role that racial thought, then in this case, has played in the modern history of Mombasa. So the period of this study is from during the time of the imposition of colonial rule in 1995, which has major consequences for reformulating local identities, to 1990, during the time of the return to multi-party politics. This period is important as it is marked by three critical junctures. First, the period between 1895 and 1950 saw the influence of colonialism on the transformation of racial categories in Mombasa. The period between 1950 and 1963 saw racial thought being deployed during the decolonization era to make specific claims on the future political direction of Mombasa. This is talking about the Mwambao debate, for example. While the period between 1963 and 1990 saw the continuation of these racialized discourses, quietly and at times bitterly, in moral debate and in political action especially in the time leading to political liberalization in the 1990s. So this study then ends at a period in Kenya where the future political direction of the country is again thrust dramatically into question. And that similar to the early and late colonial decades, we would again witness an increased deployment of racial thought in public, regarding especially the distribution of status, rights, and resources, struggles to reform Islam, which also involved public debates about proper behavior associated with wider attempts at creating a political community of Muslims. This is the period of the 1990s and after. And of course, this later period has been the subject of recent publications by our colleagues at the department, Gona, Hassan Mwakimako, have spent a lot of time researching these themes during this period in the 1990s on the coast of Kenya. So I want to delve into a particular episode in the history of, in the political history of Mombasa, where you begin to see kind of the evidence, that I use to make these conclusions that I've just touched on in the introduction. And this period, I'm going to jump right into it. It's I'm talking about 1963, during the time of independence, to the late 1970s, and the focus is on political struggles to control the political institutions of Mombasa at the time, and followed by that, the distinctive localized racial discourse that was used in this competition as well. So I also have to mention here that this period has been the subject of other studies. I'm not the first person to write about this time, but the main, if you like, departure in my work is the fact that I talk about the sort of language that was used in this political competition that could be described as a sort of local racialized discourse. A well-known study of this period is Richard Stren, who is writing from a political science perspective, and is talking about how post-colonial politics in Mombasa are being influenced by how Nairobi is shaping politics across the territory at the time. Sort of was the main influence to answer the question, for example, is KANU a proper political party or not, or is the state more powerful than the party? These kind of political science questions that we're trying to answer at that time. And because of that, he does a very good job of actually narrating what was happening politically. The other studies, of course, by George Gona, who is here with us today, which again, it's a historian's sort of notebook. It details the events as they happened, but also because the focus of that chapter within a wider work is looking at the sort of political history of an individual, in this case, Chome Ngala. So in that case, the sort of framework or theoretical angle does not really look at sort of the language, the sort of racial language that was also being used in this political competition, even though you see it in the work, but it's not distinctively highlighted as something that was influencing politics at the time and had influenced politics in Mombasa from the 1900s and up to the 1990s as well. So by struggles for the town, here I do not refer to the multiple ways in which individuals and groups, by way of complex situational networks, came to find employment, a place to stay, and also claim certain parts of a town as their homeland. There's a lot of studies around this. Here I refer instead to the struggles involving political leaders to control the political institutions of a town. struggles that nonetheless intersect or are even driven by the more complex social struggle by groups to claim a town. In Mombasa, broadly, individuals sought to enlist the new institutions of party and the municipal council so as to find patronage and support, a function that had been met by complex social structures of claim and obligation that had intervened between workers, capital, and the state in colonial Mombasa. In the struggles to control the nominal political institutions of the town, the broad and more exclusive webs of race, class, and ethnicity replaced the more fluid and inclusive webs of affiliation that had come to mean so much in the struggle for patronage, land, and employment in Mombasa. So these struggles were intensified in post-colonial Mombasa by two factors. One, Mombasa's significance as the second largest town in Kenya, meaning that control over its politics was a prerequisite to controlling the politics of the entire Coast Province, and also as a bargaining chip for national politics. This also means it invited the attention of political leaders controlling the center of the state in Nairobi. I've said this, but what existing analysis has overlooked is the explicit racial language that was involved in these factional struggles. Or as John Losden has put it elsewhere, the stuff of local competitive ethnic myth. So the independence elections of 1963, where Kenyans voted for 41 seats of the Senate, I think 129 House of Representatives, and seats of the 6 of 7 regional assemblies, meant that KANU took 72 seats of the House of Representatives, defeating its challenger KADU, which won 32. In Mombasa, however, KADU won all of the House of Representative seats. That is Mombasa Island North, Mombasa Island South, and Mombasa Mainland, as well as the Senate seat and a strong majority of the Coast Regional Assembly. While a few KANU candidates found their way into the Coast Regional Assembly, such as Ahmed Janebi from the Bajuni community of Lamu, Maalim Juma Muhammad, a Giriama Quranic teacher, but whose Islamic erudition had gained him entry into the townspeople community of Mombasa, which I'll explain what I mean by townspeople, and who had been elected as KANU branch chairman, the majority of the members of the Coast Regional Assembly had won their seats on a KADU ticket. Ngala, Ronald Ngala, was elected president of the Coast Regional Assembly and was deputized by Robert Matano, who at the time was a KADU MP for Matuga constituency. So this sort of electoral victory foregrounded Ngala's dominance in coastal politics in 1963. It was only in the municipal council elections where Ngala's dominance was reversed, and KANU took a slight lead over KADU among the 18 non-official councillors. This was due to the organizational efforts of a notable member of what I call here the lower status townspeople of the Majengo neighborhood of Mombasa, who was known as Msanifu Kombo. So I'll explain what I mean by townspeople and of course Arab and Swahili towards the end of my presentation. So the purpose with Kombo's significance in Mombasa's, Kombo's power in Mombasa's politics is that he himself had learned earlier in the 1950s to organize politically with the upcountry residents of Mombasa, particularly the Luo and the Kikuyu. And this was, of course, to petition the municipal council, but also to petition the port, the port of Mombasa, Kilindini, as it was known at the time. And due to those collaborative efforts between, the townspeople, Waswahili and the Luo and Kikuyu, a lot of them joined KANU in 1963. And due to that, Kombo used that, that influence to gain the mayorship of Mombasa. This is a very hard word for me to say. But you have Ronald Ngala being the president of the Coast Region Assembly, and Sanifu Kombo here being the mayor. But of course, 1964, we know what happened. KADU has been dissolved. Ngala and his group of supporters are forced to join a KANU, where they start fighting with Msanifu Kombo's group that had been dominating KANU since the 1950s. Now, I want to go over the details of what happens in the fight to control the political party KANU, but also the municipal council. But the main factional line here is that on one line, you had politicians who described themselves as Mijikenda. A term that in the 1960s had probably only existed in political discourse less than 20 years. So this term, is traced in research that has been published. Justin Willis and George Gona, they trace the term, the Mijikenda becoming a useful political term from a meeting in 1944 that is held in Rabai, where an association known as the Mijikenda Union is formed. Of course, before that, people did not really identify themselves with the term Mijikenda, but by 1962, the term had made its way into the national census. And Donald Ngala in particular, who comes from the Giriama community, really mobilizes this term and uses this term politically to mobilize a community of people on the coast or greater Mombasa who had felt excluded during the colonial period, especially from land distribution, but also from rights, but even from status as well, that their status had changed during the colonial period, that sort of emphasized Arab status, for example, right? So to be thought to be an Arab, for example, in the colonial period, was to claim status, was also to claim land, was also to claim resources. In this way, a lot of Arab families, especially from Omani, especially from the Busaidi clan of the Omani, had access to the land registry, but also were given titles, freehold titles and leasehold titles along the coast, excluding those who were at the time known as the Nyika. These distinctions, of course, these are local terms that were used at the time: Arab, Swahili, Nyika. But basically, it's the distinction that we see across colonial Africa, which is the distinction between native and non-native.
No, I know you're looking at me.
Which then is to say, this was a question about citizenship and who belongs. And this has consequences in the post-colonial
Stop looking so cute over there, Noah.
Deemed as non-native during the colonial period, they're coming in the post-colonial period and claiming their status as citizens of Mombasa, and that, as Francis Hamisi wrote in one of his newspapers, that there is no foreign race in this land, and that this land is black, and that no one from outside of Africa came with a buckload of soil, for example. These kind of arguments people were having in the 1950s and 1960s, but they were very people were defining
Noah,
and debating
your stinky ass back on camera.
What it means to be black and what it means
back on
in a town where
white doesn't mean that you don't get to play the role.
These categories were
Stinky
very
cracker.
fluid
how many
historically.
slaves did
But
you
during
kill
the
to get
colonial
this
period,
computer
because identity
that you're
had to be
watching on?
static, the colonial administrative work, colonial intellectual work crystallized these identities, and therefore you only had to be either African or Arab. You could not be anywhere between. The point here is that this has consequences in the 1960s. So on one side, you have a group led by Donald Ngala, who has really mobilized this Mijikenda ethnonym. And on the other side, you have
nigga, shut up.
This is the reason why I use the term lower status townspeople. Those who were not described as Nyika or later Mijikenda, but then they were also not accepted as Arabs. This is the group where many people we refer to as Swahili would fall into. But in the 1960s,
You can
what
never
happens in
stop
Mombasa
me,
is gonna be very
nigga.
different from what happens in
Never ever
Zanzibar.
keep trying
In
to mute me,
Zanzibar,
buddy.
this category of this community
Stop trying to mute me, buddy. What are
is
you
not
doing?
accepted as Arab, led a revolution.
Nigga.
Right, so you have the Zanzibar Revolution, 1964 January. In Mombasa, what you have is that
Stop
those
muting
who are
me or I'm
not
going to keep
accepted as
going.
Arabs during the colonial period
If you don't mute me,
actually
I won't go
joined
anymore.
the sort of Arab
Just kidding,
urban-based
nigga.
Muslim project,
You just got played.
where Arabs took a low profile in public politics. It was the Swahilis, those who had been referred to as the Swahilis, who championed the interests of a sort of continental urban Muslim imaginary against Chome Ngala and his political supporters, mainly originating from the immediate hinterland of Mombasa. So these are the sort of factional lines that emerge in the 1960s. And of course, they influence the political struggles to control the political institutions of Mombasa. In this case, KANU, the KANU branch of Mombasa, but also the Municipal Council of Mombasa. But of course, you know that Ngala passes on in 1972.
You thought you could keep me out, huh?
That really
Guess
takes
what,
away
Mohammed?
the
Suck your balls.
the energy and the
Mark,
intensity
within the muko. Stop looking like that, bro.
of the struggle.
Your bald ass looking at me.
And
Which
like I
Mark?
said,
What
this
you come your
has
mouth
been the
for, bro?
subject
I know you're
of
laughing.
other publications. My main
Look at me, Mark.
interest
Within the
in
muko.
looking at this episode was to actually examine the racialized language that I talk about, which is the main theme of my presentation that was used during the struggles. So race in Mombasa, of course, given the legacy of slavery and the tense debates
How
about
did I
the
get
future
back
of
in
the
here?
Kenyan coast,
Why a hacker?
1950s.
I have
Yeah, I'm talking
hackings.
about the Mombao debate.
Mark, within the muko.
Is often
Bitch ass
discussed by residents in very subtle ways and in situational and contextual language. Racial discourse in Mombasa often involves terms of wider social discourse and the application of specific rhetorical strategies and arguments. Terms such as wajomba, it may not mean much, but this is a term that is often used by the Mijikenda in reference to
That's what you get. Everyone
but it
gets
could
to
also
hear
be
me
in
say
reference to people who are thought to be Mijikenda turncoats and who do not want to accept their Mijikenda origins and want to be associated with the townspeople. So it can have sort of multiple embedded meanings. There are other terms like wanyika, ustaarabu, or ushenzi, etc. These are terms that are prominent in a localized racial discourse. These, I want to call them hidden transcripts, to use James C. Scott's phraseology. They give meaning to the hierarchical nature of cultural difference in coastal society that is often foregrounded by different traditions of origin, where some groups have claimed to originate from the Middle East and others from the continental Africa. But it also evokes multiple and hierarchical visions of culture, progress, and generally what it means to be modern and civilized. This social differentiation that pits the Mijikenda against coastal townspeople, these are the Swahilis and the Arabs, is, to use Janet McIntosh's words, laced with inequality. This social differentiation is also marked with mutual exclusion and suspicion. Powerful prejudices and essentialisms circulate amongst townspeople and Mijikenda communities. They shape their discourses about their own identity and the alterity of the other group. In fact, as the title of her book suggests, The Age of Islam, the Mijikenda, who at the turn of the 20th century could much more easily become Swahili, they came to find themselves during much of the colonial and post-colonial period on the margins of a spatial and metaphorical geography, peering in at a life of greater privilege and sometimes cognizant that they are on the brink of access, but not quite able to break through. Local conceptions of civilization would continue to be defined in the post-colonial period in a context where the category of those who had been deemed to be civilized, that is higher status Swahili or Arabs, was expanded this time in the 1960s to include lower status townspeople. Now, with the effective end of the Mwambao debate in 1963, followed by the debate about whether Kenya should have a Majimbo constitution or not, the focus of political context in Mombasa moved away from the structure of government should take to struggles over the local institutions, as I talked about. Yet at the same, however, the dynamics of that context remained similar. It was in effect racialized, with an underlying logic of Africans versus non-Africans. And this is where it gets really interesting, because people with darker skin than myself at that time thought of themselves as not Africans, you know, and this, in fact, made a lot of sense to the audience at the time, given the history, of course, of the place. So we have to actually, I have to actually mention here that there was some redefinition of those categories, African and African, internally, particularly amongst those whom Ronald Ngala and his supporters had characterized as the other, that is the townspeople community. Rhetorically, townspeople entirely abandoned claims to exotic origin, rather presenting themselves as distinctly townspeople, a categorization that avoided the stigma of being of foreign origins, but also still laid rightful claim to the town. But some within that group used the struggle with Ngala to redraw the lines of racial hierarchy within town society. These reaffirmed town society as culturally distinct, Muslim and urban, but also open up the possibility of political advance to those who might previously have been of lower status on racial grounds. So like Sanifu Kombo, for example, who himself would not have been thought to be of higher status, or even to be Swahili or Arab, 10 years before, became a high-ranking member of Swahili urban society as a mayor in the 1960s and 1970s, right? And there are so many examples of people who even changed their identity completely, you know, who Giriama, 1950, 1960, someone like Malim Juma, who was the most talked about Quranic teacher, for example. And as one of the people I interviewed said, he could read the Quran better than Arabs. But he was a Giriama, originally a Giriama. So cultural, religious, and most notably clientage and kinship networks with coastal Arabs had proved significant for these lower status townspeople who are now seeking higher status in the post-colonial world. These conceptions of society, ostensibly inclusive, yet contributing to hierarchical beliefs and practices that here look uncomfortably like racism, were affecting not only social relations in post-colonial Mombasa, but the town's politics as well. The factional lines drawn in the struggle to control Mombasa's political institutions in the immediate post-colonial decade had aligned with more familiar lines of class and personal alliance, but they were generally reflective of the cultural distinctions that had defined Mombasa's history since the town's medieval origins. Put simply, the tensions between its continental and maritime orientations. So, Msanifu Kombo, who, by the way, whose Kenyan citizenship became a subject of contention in public quarrels with his rivals, had begun his political career as a youth organizer. Kombo successfully kept the youth and women section of what was called the Mombasa Convention Party in the 1950s, you know, busy singing songs and in lorries, distributing leaflets, disrupting meetings, and even intimidating opponents. He has been described as a Shirazi. Shirazi is a community of Muslims on the south coast of Kenya who claim Shirazi, or in this case, Persian origins. But his ex-widow, whom I interviewed, told me the Shirazis are just Digos. Don't listen to people telling you anything. Of course, Kombo was born, raised, and was buried at Sargoi in the Majengo neighborhood of Mombasa. Together with Shekwe Ali, Kombo was part of the community in Mombasa that had been rejected as true Swahili, as I'd mentioned, or real coastal townspeople. During a time, the colonial period, where to be accepted as true Swahili, one had to emphasize or convince officials of one's uncontested Arab or non-native roots. Others could not. It was during the immediate post-colonial period that Kombo and his community came to champion the interests of Mombasa's townspeople as a whole, vis-a-vis the challenge that was mounted by Ngala, a Mijikenda politician. To the Mijikenda who were paying attention to public affairs at the time, people are interviewed. They said the Kombo group, they call them the Kombo group, had aligned themselves to that Arab side of the top and were being used by the people of the top, that is the Arabs. They were being used by them. That's what one person told me. But I think that the ties were deeper than would be in an unprincipled contractual relationship. Kombo's ex-widow was herself the great-granddaughter of a Giriama woman who had been incorporated into the townspeople community during the last decades of the 19th century. Kombo's closest political ally, Malim Juma, whom I've mentioned, was a Giriama from Kaloleng, Ngala's birthplace, who, as I was being told, knew how to read the Quran better than Arabs. And due to this, had been incorporated into the townspeople community as a respected Quranic teacher. Not only were no townspeople attempting to work their way up the racial hierarchy, they were redefining the hierarchy altogether. The other key member of the Kombo group was Abdallah Mwidau. Like Kombo, Mwidau's Kenyan citizenship also became a matter of public debate, fueled by his rivals. And like Kombo, Mwidau's roots were on the most southerly parts of the Kenyan coast border in Tanzania. He was born and raised in Mombasa and married to a middle-class Swahili family, later becoming the business partner of another Kombo ally, Mohammed Jahazi. Jahazi was himself married to the daughter of Sheikh Haida Kindi, the former deputy Tamim of the 3 tribes of Mombasa. In other words, a notable townsperson. The other member of the group that challenged Ngala's leadership of political institutions in Mombasa was Salim Muhammad Balala, a Hadrami Arab. So in the ensuing struggle, Msanifu Kombo and his allies thought that Ngala should not become the branch chair of Kano, Mombasa branch, as long as he remained the MP of Kilifi and the national vice chairman of Kano, representing the Coast province. This charge was taken to the press by Kombo, where a print, sort of public sphere, civic public sphere was emerging. But one of Ngala's supporters that I interviewed also said this. What Kombo's group really hated is that Ngala is a member of parliament in Kilifi. Ngala is minister in the national government. I'm just reading the quote. But Ngala is also the chairman of Kano in Mombasa. And every time they tried to defeat him, they couldn't. They wondered what strength Ngala had. Yet to them, he was just a Mnyika. He should go to Nyika, which is the hinterland. They used to say that Ngala should go to his homeland, Kilifi. That's what they used to say, the Muhammad Jahazis. The differences between Ngala and Kombo's group persisted throughout the 1960s. In fact, if we are to remove the cast of individuals, it persisted up until Karisa Maitha's time with the former MP of Kisauni, whose name is not coming to mind quickly. But then it goes on up to now, Hassan Joho, and it continues, right? But these struggles or these differences were informed by a past and present of privilege and injustice along racial lines, separating the interests of the townspeople from those of the Mijikenda. Even more important is the fact that the differences were underscored by the hierarchical relationship of cultures, in this case, maritime over continental, that were increasingly being imagined in mutually exclusive ways. Again, as McIntosh explains, the hierarchies that also mark the distinctiveness of Mijikenda from the townspeople community are often expressed in the emotional lives and the ontological claims of Swahili and Giriama alike. In addition, patterns of speech and behavior, greetings and terms of status and emotional states of being, reflected, as Kai Kresser explains, reflected the underlying idiom of social hierarchy in coastal society as a whole. Some with kinship origins in the immediate hinterland of Mombasa, in this context, came to assume urban, supposedly more sophisticated Swahili Arab identities in town, that at times they would claim later had no ethnic or racial relations in the hinterland. In Likoni, on the southern mainland of Mombasa, people were aware of distinctive qualities, marking out urbanized Digos from Digos deemed to have more hinterland roots, as it was explained to me by a resident of Likoni. Most Digos here in Likoni came from Kwale district, Bombo and Ukunda mostly, but they got stuck here. Now, Digos of Kwale and Digos of Likoni have differences even in the way they speak the Digo language. The Digos of Kwale speak like Kwale Durumas. Unlike the Digos of Likoni, For instance, Rora for look by Kwale Digos and Lola for Likoni Digos. There are differences including in how we prepare food. The Kwale Digos also took up more of Western education than Likoni Digos. Of course, under the influence of urban Swahili culture, Likoni Digos feared they would become Christians. A resident of Changamwe on the western side of Mombasa Island explained that such differences between Mijikenda groups in town and those in the hinterland had even led to the emergence of new identities. These Duruma, reading quote, this Duruma, Mijikenda of Duruma ethnicity, who live in Mombasa, it came a time when they didn't want to be called Duruma. They wanted to be called Mwambao because they had been hoodwinked by these Arabs. It is because of a lot of Uswahili, literally Swahiliness. But only these Durumas of Mombasa, who call themselves Changamwe, of course, classifying themselves as one of the groups of the three tribes or the Swahili, they didn't want to be called Duruma. The ones in Kinango, in Kwale district, in the hinterland, call themselves Duruma. There's this thing of being called Mnyika, that they, Durumas living in Mombasa, didn't want to be called. That's how the name Changamwe came to be. Similarly, McIntosh reported that middle-class Swahili women sometimes express revulsion at the prospect of marrying a Giriama, while many Giriama harbor moral antipathy towards Swahili, whom they tend to see as self-serving elites. Yet, as we shall see, or as explained in the contest between Ngala and Sanif Kombo, no, actually, I confused myself. This kind of criticism was also leveled at educated, often Christian Mijikenda, who, in multiple debates over claim and obligation with their less educated or uneducated kin, were cast as unhelpful and selfish. Of course, facing marginalization within Kenya's political economy, the ability of Mijikenda elites to advance the exclusive interests of their kin was constrained in comparison to upcountry elites, as was the perception. And as a result, they were seen as not getting their kin, the right jobs and right connections the way their upcountry counterparts supposedly do. The Giriama of Malindi in particular, also where McIntosh conducted a study, also resented their structural role as petty wage laborers in a steep hierarchy, and sometimes politically agitated in ways that pit them directly and deliberately against Swahili. As reported by Justin Willis, the Swahili in these stories often occupy a nebulous middle ground, sometimes described as shameless Mijikenda turncoats denying their origins, and at other times dismissed as being the same as Arabs and related to the Mijikenda. So using a similar interpretive frame to explain the factional struggles to control Mombasa's political institutions in the mid post-colonial decade, a former Kanu youth activist who served in that role in the 1960s explained, Ngala wanted to fight the influence of Uislamu, literally Islam is Islamness, or an Islamic pattern of culture as opposed to the theology of Islam. This also aligns with Marshall Hodgins' idea of the Islamicate, which refers not directly to the religion, but to the social and cultural complex historically associated with Islam and Muslims, both among Muslims themselves and even when found among non-Muslims. So seen in this manner, the battle for Mombasa's political institutions was also a struggle between two visions of culture and community. These visions had coexisted in an unequal and a hierarchical relationship. On one hand was a rural, continental, and African-oriented vision that was being articulated more aggressively by those who became Mijikenda, vis-a-vis an urban, maritime, and Islamic-oriented vision of society, which was being redefined in the post-colonial decades from within and which was represented by those who became part of the townspeople community. So during the post-colonial era, the vision of Mombasa evoked by townspeople leaders was highly different from that expressed by Arab leaders of Mombasa in the colonial period. In fact, one of them, Sheikh Mohammed Muhashami, during debates over the future of Mombao, had proclaimed that the protectorate Kenya Coastal Strip is basically Arab by tradition, by culture, and by outlook. Conversely, for Ngala, Ronan Ngala, it continued to be an undisputable fact that the coastal strip is a part of Africa and that the land belonged to the Africans and no one else. Racial thought lingered on in post-colonial Mombasa in this manner, and it came to assume a central place in the ongoing battle between Islamic and non-Islamic traditions, African and non-African cultural modes, and between local notions of civilization, this is Ustaarabu, and barbarism, Ushenzi. In fact, the most consistent claim by the Combo Group against Ngala's predominance of the local party branch in Mombasa and the municipal council had been that Ngala was tribal. That is, he overly favored members of his own Giriama ethnic community. There was a fight that broke out in 1968 outside of the local party branch office, during which Msanifu Kombo was attempting to regain control of the local party branch. The provincial commissioner allowed Kombo to hold public meetings in Mombasa. In one major meeting, on the 21st of March 1968, where Kombo and his allies faced a crowd of about 3,000 people, Ngala was unanimously denounced as a tribalist. But the charges went further than that. Addressing the audience, Kombo's speech looped back around tropes of dirt and filth that he claimed had been introduced into the local party by the Ngala group, and which he told his audience he was prepared to clean it up. This language contrasting dirt and cleanliness was repeated ad nauseum by Kombo and his faction on the run-up to the 1968 local council elections, for example. In meetings not covered by the press, the language was more innocuous. However, as an observer of Mombasa politics at the time remembers, quote, they would really insult the Mijikenda that they are Wanyika, Washamba, rural, and that they dress in mahando, Mijikenda traditional attire worn by women. They used to say that Mombasa will not be ruled by mahando, but by the buibui, traditional attire worn by Muslim women. Another meeting amongst Mombasa's political leadership was held at the town hall, the headquarters of the municipal council. It barely succeeded in brokering a truce. And during a subsequent meeting to present the results of the discussion, Ngala insisted that he was not a tribalist and presented a list of local party branch officials to prove it. Defending him, Ngala supporters who I talked to have claimed that he was the one responsible for the nomination, for example, to parliament of Salim Muhammad Balala, who was a key member of the Kombo faction. And I think also the uncle to the Balala that we know currently. Balala actually was subsequently appointed an assistant minister, which is a senior government position at the time. This, as the claim goes, came after a delegation went to visit Jomo Kenyatta in Nairobi that was led by Mohamed Jahazi, where the group allegedly reported their concerns to Kenyatta that if Ngala was given the role of picking a name for the position of nominated MP from the coast region, he would suggest a Kazungu or a Charo. These are common Giriama names. Yet in Mombasa, we are Muslims. It will bring problems. It's a quote. Given that a Giriama can also be a Muslim, Jahazi and his faction, in essence, and if this assertion holds, was offering a categorical framework that was explicitly Muslim, but also implicitly racialized. To simultaneously respond to the charge that he was a tribalist and to counter the influence of Mombasa's maritime orientations or Islamic patterns of culture, as I've just discussed, Ngala closed ranks with the former deputy secretary of the Coast People's Party, CPP, which was an advocate of separation of the coast from the rest of Kenya in the 1950s, named Sharif Nasir, whom he thought he would later control. Now, despite his membership to a party that had clamored for the independence of Mwambao during the late colonial period, the project that was supported by higher Swahili and Arabs, Nasir had been derisively regarded as a Mwarabu Koko, which means fake Arab, or an Arab whose ancestry had mixed with Africans. The assertion, again, according to an observer of Mombasa politics at the time, was that he was not a pure Arab to them, this is the higher Swahilian Arabs. He was like a bastardized Arab, you know? So they did not accept him, you see? And for those in the middle ground, literally meaning middle hierarchy, and in reference to Kombo's faction, they saw that Nasir was too superior for them because he had nywele za singa, that is straight hair. So Sharif Nasir was looking for a place to be accepted. That is how he began identifying with the Mnyika. That this Mnyika had a large following, that this Mnyika had a big constituency, which is the Mijikenda. If I stick with them, I will inherit the Mijikenda vote. And that is exactly what Sharif went for. Sharif Nasir had first been introduced to Ngala's group by John Mambo. John Mambo had defeated Msanifu Kombo for the mayoral seat in 1965. Ngala's protege. It was during his term as mayor that John Mambo established a business partnership with Sharif Nasir, whose family owned a maritime business company. In the meeting to discuss Nasir's entry into Ngala's group, only one person, a councillor from Fia Town named Henry Farah, and who was also Ngala's relative by marriage, opposed the move, citing Nasir's past association with the Mambao movement as a problem. To Ngala, the plan was to represent Nasir as Mohamed Jahazi's challenger for the seat of Mombasa Central during the then upcoming 1974 general elections. And as the quote goes, so as to stop Uislamu in Mombasa. As a result, to an observer of Mombasa police at the time, Sharif Nasir came to extend Unyika, literally Nyikaness, supremacy in Mombasa. And he would be challenged by the Jahazi group, not because he was an Arab, but because he had joined Unyika. To them, Sharif Nasir was not one of their own townspeople. They would say that Sharif Nasir had sold Islam cheaply, and that he had close ranks with the Nyika and the Christians, that he was building and contributing to the building of churches, that on that account, he was no longer one of their own. So they presented themselves as more Muslim, Jahazi, Msanifu Kombo. They became more Muslim than Sharif Nasir, since to them, Sharif Nasir had become a Mnyika. End of quote. As Ngala had wanted, Nasir defeated Mohamed Jahazi during the 1974 general elections to become the MP for Mombasa Central, a position he held until 2002. In fact, it was Rogers Msechu, Ngala's former ally, who had served in the 1964-1965 Senate, who did the talking during Sharif Nasir's campaign meetings, because it was feared that by the administration that Nasir would stoke controversy over the circumstances surrounding Ngala's death. It wasn't long, however, before Nasir was thought to be turning against key areas of Mijikenda social, economic, and public life in Mombasa. A move that was perceived by some Mijikenda as an attempt by an Arab politician to quote-unquote purify Mombasa town of its excessive hinterland influences. In other words, once in a position of authority, Nasir sought to assert his own claims to cultural superiority and status by defining town life as distinct from the hinterland. In this debate, tropes of dirt and cleanliness, as I've just mentioned, were once again repeated. Similar to a trend, just giving an example, similar to a trend that has been noted by Louis White in our social history of colonial Nairobi, migration by women from Mombasa's immediate hinterland, whether Nyika or Mijikenda women, depending on the period, had long been adopted as a strategy meant to escape the patriarchal control of the hinterland household. In the event, the Mijikenda community invaded the town in a wider post-colonial trend suggested across interviews where the neighbors of Kisauni, Changamwe, and Likoni came to be increasingly settled by new migrants in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. While opportunities for incorporation of Mijikenda women into the townspeople community had seriously diminished, many were still able to establish a life in Mombasa independent of the security that would be offered by the hinterland household, aching precarious lives as concubines, sellers of palm wine, and collecting rent from lodgers of rooms in traditional Swahili type houses that they owned. When Daniel Arap Moi became president in 1978, succeeding Jomo Kenyatta after Kenyatta's death, Nasir besieged the new president to impose a rather vague but effective ban on palm wine. Nasir also put to use his growing close association to Moi and addressed part of Mombasa's land problem that emanated from the land rationalization policies of the early colonial period. In Mwembe Tanganyika, a location within Majengo, a large Hadrami Arab landowner, known as Swalenguru, was convinced to subdivide and sell part of his large estate to the small house owners who had built on it. Such successful lobbying, however, was limited within Nasir's own Mombasa Central constituency, which is residentially dominated by lower status townspeople or poor Swahilis or poor Arabs. An attempt by Mijikenda party activists to remove him, this is Nasir, from the local party branch as chairman during the second half of the 1970s failed, after which, as one of them told me, all Mijikenda party youth wingers were removed one by one, and all the Digo women and Giriama women were all replaced by light-skinned Swahili women who played the Vugwe dance, which he told me is favored by townspeople. Very light-skinned women, and he organized Swahili youth into clubs, such that when the president visited Mombasa, it was only Wamiji, townspeople, who would be seen in front singing, dancing, and cheering. About to finish. In sum, townspeople had regained control of Mombasa's formal political institutions through Nasir's eventual dominance over the local party branch. Coupled with the mayoralty of Abdallah Muidau, who was succeeded as mayor of Mombasa by another townsperson, Rajab Sumba, there was a sudden retreat of the Mijikenda in Mombasa's political life, a trend that would slightly be halted with the rise of the political career of Karisa Maitha, who eventually became MP for Kisauni in the 1990s. Meanwhile, between the 1960s and 1980s, there was a steady growth in Mombasa's population and new migrants into the town, many of them from up-country Kenya, dwarfed the size of the townspeople community. Townspeople would continue to valorize exotic religious and cultural reference from Arabia, and with the possibilities of incorporation into the coastal townspeople community diminished, ethnic boundaries and essentialisms were emphasized as people, especially new migrants, struggled to improve their circumstances in a post-colonial town. As a result, broad and more exclusive webs of race, class, and ethnicity came to replace, in the post-colonial era, the more fluid and inclusive webs of affiliation that had, at the turn of the 20th century and before, meant so much in the struggle for patronage, land, and employment. Generally, the lesson is that categories of race remained powerful as discursive and effective force, mobilizing political action, and that the tension between the maritime versus the continental imaginaries of the coast remained fundamental. But at the same time, these categories, especially for townspeople, could be renegotiated to some extent from within. In the context of national politics that were dominated by upcountry Christian elites on one hand, and the emerging geopolitical significance of the Middle East on the other hand, the townspeople community came to find themselves domiciled in what Kai Krasa has referred to as the double periphery. These concerns were expressed through various Swahili Muslim publics, as he goes on to refer to them, where attention was not only placed on political questions, but also on prescriptions of appropriate social behavior and civic virtue, or simply attributes that sought to emphasize the distinctiveness of townspeople culture from the hinterland. These internal moral discourses also took place in a context where the structure of land ownership in Mombasa and elsewhere on the Kenyan coast, and hence of privilege and status, had changed very little since the Titles Ordinance that I'm sure we know about of 1908. So I'll stop.
No, you are just within that time, actually. Almost 46, 47 minutes. That is just within the time that you had. Now, friends, those of you who are here and those who are online, that's a very interesting discourse. You know, the trajectory of racial thinking, very interesting exchanges, and I look forward to reading your PhD thesis, Ngala. It must be a very interesting read, which you have just submitted, and you have graduated with your PhD from Durham University in the UK. Now, you know, as I listened, I had a very persistent, multiple and interlocking contestations, you know, as well as creation and recreation of identities, of course, with race as a framing category. I'm sure the audience here live and those of us who are online, you have a number of questions or observations or comments to make, and this is our time. Let's begin with the live audience here, and then we can go to the online audience. Our friends online, please, we will give a chance for you to raise your questions. And if you can actually raise some of them on the chat, just as we have our audience here responding. Yes, I see Malim Odiambo over there. Please take a microphone to Malim.
Yes, Ngala, thank you very much. That's a lot of work done. As I listened, I imagined a play, a stage, and a play. In theater, what happens is role play. So you assume roles, so you can negotiate yourself out of that. So in a classical sense, where there are few people to play roles, in one scene, one character is playing this role. The next scene, they're playing a different role. I mean, this is a classical thing about drag dances, right? So you have no idea whether it's a man or a woman, etc. So this happens because in theater, you kind of mark off the stage. So one character can't transit from one point to another unless they are willing to assume a different identity. Then they can cross the boundaries. So as I listened to you, I was interested in how people negotiate these relationships and identities, and practically for what? So for an example, you probably have Swahili, right? Who over a period of time has urbanized. The skin has become lighter. They've gone to Mecca. They've become more urbanized than Swahili, right? But they are quite aware of their Bara or Nyika or Mijikenda, or let's just be specific, Giriama roots, which then they produce when it's at a time of political campaigns, like right now, right? So I was interested as you spoke that whereas we who read these things often essentialize race, ethnicity, we mark it so specifically in academic discourse, people are quite clever about how they play these things, right? And I've always thought of Mombasa and the entire coastline as one dramatic scene, that if you went there in the morning, actually you'll be shocked that somebody has a particular character, especially right now at Ramadan. It's incredible how Christians are going to eat foods claiming that they are Muslims. And they have no qualms about this. It's not about morality. It's about the practicality of everyday life. So I was curious about you telling me how the Mdruma woman, right, somewhere in Changamwe, collapsing her Duruma identity into a Giriama identity, but practically performing her Islamic identity. Just that.
We will take a couple of questions and then Malim will respond. Dr. Nyanjoga, give us a microphone here. And then we have Dr. Gona, Dr. Gache over there, and then we have Malim Kule here. Yes, in that order.
Thank you very much, Ngara. I've seen you for the first time, but I'm really impressed with your work. I've forgotten.
It was our student Kilian Ngala, if you remember that.
That's very good. Yeah, you know, I came a bit late, but I've listened to your presentation where you talk about race or race you're thinking. I'm not a historian per se, but at least I did history in my preliminary years. I was wondering, I was asking myself a question. How much of propaganda is in racial thinking? Because you see, some of the issues you have talked of, you know, how people refer to each other. I thought this is not the reality. It must be propaganda. So then from your study, I wanted to know how much of reality I will follow from that and how much propaganda is there and the balance thereof. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Observation.
Yes, Mwalimu Gona, and then Mwalimu Gachehe, Mwalimu Kila, and then Mwalimu Gachehe there.
Ngala, thanks for taking me back to 1988 when I was doing my research. I think I'm taken back with nostalgia, so to speak, because some of these things, like you've observed, I interacted with them and talked to people like Kombo and others. But I have got three issues. One is this man called Rajab Sumba, who became a mayor of Mombasa. His background was a slave background, therefore an outsider from Takaungu, and a Muslim. To what extent did he, demystify, the kind of racial arrangements in which you are actually engaging? So that is one. Then this is something deeper, perhaps closer to me, because I some of these languages used, and I've heard these people use it. Now, I'll give you an example of my friend Mubarak, whose young brother is the chief executive of the Anti-Corruption Commission. He used to call a classmate of ours Al-Kaumi. Now, this is a Kauma, but when he prefixes with the Al-Kaumi, is like you are a converted Muslim, but not Muslim enough. I don't know to what extent this debate came to you, and what do you make of it? And then thirdly, something that I would want possibly you and I and somebody else to work on is the racialized language that is in the Islamic practice, in which there are hierarchies, in which even you and I, if you were to be Muslim, we will be buried in a different cemetery. When actually in Islam, we're supposed to be at the same level. We are all Muslims. And so I think we can follow up that point, and see how we can do some research on that. But the two areas I would want you to respond to. Thanks.
All right, David, ambiguities of equality in religious practice. They're also there in Christianity. Yes, David.
Thank you very much. Like I keep on saying in every one of these seminars, I keep on learning things. But today, it's not just learning, but it's like going back in time. Because virtually every name that you have mentioned, I think I have had some experience with all these people, Jahazi, Sharif Nasir, Kombo. I think at some point in my life, I did something, maybe even campaigning for some of those fellows, especially in the mid 80s, I think from 1984 to about 1989, thereabouts. I think I was very active with one of those fellows. But that's not what I'm asking about. My question is something that just kept on skinning into my mind, and it takes me back to over 1,000 years ago, in what we call the advent of the Swahili civilization and the Swahili culture. Because the way you're presenting it, it is like the distinctions between the so-called Nika, the Swahili, and Arabs. It is so firm, such that you would have imagined if the conventional theory that Swahilis are products of the Africans and the Arabs, then these Arabs are not the Arabs, but these Africans are not the Nika. which then brings me to the question, then who were they if it wasn't the Nika? And okay, so we have some archaeological evidence from places like Getty, which seems to suggest there could have been some other fellows with funny names which sound racial, to say the least. But then, are you suggesting that this thing that seems to be coming out from those interactions of now and the 1950s going through the 1960s would then suggest that the so-called Nika have got nothing to do with Swahili origins? I don't know whether that question is clear, but
that's clear. Okay, Dr. Gachehe, Mwalimu Kile. Let's finish with Gachehe, and then we will stop there, and then we will go online.
Thank you very much, Chome. Very proud that you are where you are now. And thank you for sharing your thoughts on localized racial thought and how that has shaped identity politics in Mombasa. Now, what has been the import of this racial thought outside of Mombasa, especially, for example, in shaping the political discourse between Mombasa and the rest of national politics? That is one. Secondly, I don't know how far it has worked as a vehicle of integration of coastal politics to nationalist politics, more or less the same question as I've asked just a minute ago. Or would you say that this racial thought, localized racial thought, has cultivated a parallel and a very distinct political culture, that is only identifiable with Mombasa? And therefore, finally, to what extent has this contributed, for example, or informed this thinking that Mombasa sio Kenya, right? And who is saying Mombasa sio Kenya?
Yeah, Pwani sio Kenya.
Pwani,
same thing.
Mombasa. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yes. Very interesting how the questions, my answer is there's a logical progression from actually where you ended. So to Tom, I think Tom, you sort of also kind of anticipated the answer, and you make a very good point. In fact, for me, the sort of theoretical, intellectual interest was to sort of try to understand how identity works. Just basically coming from the intellectual tradition of identities are socially constructed, and so therefore what, right? So if they're socially constructed, how are they socially constructed? How are they redefined? For me, that was the initial kind of intellectual premise. And I thought that Mombasa, in particular, and the Kenyan coast, is a perfect place. Where, I mean, I grew up there. I have to, disclose that. But such stories of, someone who has slavery ancestry, they become an Arab, or they become these are things I grew up with, right? But in academia, as you rightly put it, we sort of view, especially in not in history as much, not in anthropology as much, particularly in political science, you'd find that these categories are taken for granted. People even do surveys, and they can predict political behavior based on certain identities. But of course, the story is much more complicated than that. The identities are more fluid. They serve very practical and immediate purposes, as examples here I've issued. And I think that's the reason why. It's because people are trying to improve their circumstances. That sentence I've repeated in my thesis across all the chapters. People were constantly trying to improve their circumstances in a constantly changing environment. And this is not an environment that is changing during the colonial period. It has been changing for 1,000 years. A place that has visitors coming from all over the world. The tension that emerges You know, and this you know is a debate of historians of the Kenyan coast, 1970s, 1980s, were having this debate. Some of them teaching here at the time. This tension, they don't put it in this way, but this tension between the continental imaginaries and the maritime imaginaries of the coast emerge because new cultures, new ideas, new traditions are arriving from outside, but there's a pre-existing culture that also has to maintain its own distinctiveness. So how do you maintain that tension between new ideas and what you think of as local ideas? So if you emerge as if you are the residents of the coastal towns, what was then called the Swahili by the Arabs, and then became Swahili, but actually later calling themselves, modern day Swahilis remember that community, that medieval Swahili community as Wangozi, call them Wangozi, right? So also that's another kind of discussion there. The point here is if you have Arabs from Oman, Arabs from especially Hadramaut coming to Mombasa, coming to Lamu, coming to Pate, and you have a community that has intermixed with them, but also has its own distinctiveness as not Arabs. How do you maintain that tension, right? And these anthropologists, these historians, they talk about this tension was maintained through poetry. So for example, discussing what is the right behavior. Usishike Warabu sana, wajua sisi si Warabu, kuna poetry, or dancing competitions amongst different neighborhoods of the city state, right? Whereby other dance troops, they bring the more kind of African influence, the other bring the more. So that's how the tension was resolved over the years. The other way in which the tension was resolved was fluidity. So the possibility of someone rising through the hierarchy was always there, but there were qualifications. And mostly these qualifications were Islamic erudition. You have to be moral piety, wealth, language, these things that constituted what we now know as Ustaarabu. But at the time, the civilizational ideal of the time was something called Ungwana. Ungwana, which becomes replaced by Ustaarabu right about the 1850s when Omani Arab power comes into the area through British colonization of East Africa, right? So these kind of mechanics, if you like, are what kept the society together. But what happens is that in the colonial period, colonial intellectual work, and this goes to your answer, Molimu. So what colonial intellectual work then did is, because wherever they went, colonization as a project is not really interested in complexities of the local population. They want order. So you are either an Arab or an African. You can't be, because we need to register you and we need to know if you're going to be working and we need to know if you're going to have certain rights. So that project entered Mombasa, and it was the most confusing period, not only for officials, but also for the residents of Mombasa. Because what do you have there? You have ex-slaves, an entire population of ex-slaves. You have Arabs. You have Arabs who have properly mixed with Africans. The Mazruis, for example, they can't even speak Arabic, right? And then you have up-country Africans. In this case, Kavirondo, coming from Kavirondo. We have this milieu of population. How do you distinguish this population? If someone says, looking as dark as me, that my great-grandfather came from Shiraz, who are you to say, no, he did not? And this was happening. But that was not a simple thing. It was, if it is proved that you are an Arab, it means you have access to land title. So it was not just a debate for fun or for intellectual. It had real consequences, which is why it was very tense and bitter as we were approaching the 1950s, and Kenya's independence is imminent. Yeah. So yes, I agree with you that there was fluidity in the past, but this begins to change in the colonial period. But it's not only racial thinking or racism across Africa. Even ethnicity was rigid. Was rigid during the colonial period. Became more rigid during the colonial period. The studies, so many studies about this. Rajab Sumba, I think I've just anticipated the answer to that as well. I mean, there are certain qualifications, that can allow you to rise up the hierarchy, then become mayor, for example, become respected in the townspeople community. And individuals like Rajab Sumba, Msani Fukombo, even the Mudaus, they very well were able to negotiate their status within the hierarchy. Yes, people will know of your origins. People knew of the origins of Malim Juma. People knew of the origins of the leader, actually, of one of the parties that clamored for Mwambao, which Mwambao was a project of Warabu and Waswahili. The leader of the party, Congress, I think it was called Congress, was Amchoni. His background was Amchoni. And people knew that. But it does not matter if the person has renegotiated their status and has been accepted. Simnyika tena, amestaarabika. That's Rajab Sumba now. That's how you understand someone like Msani Fukombo. And this becomes much more of the case in the 1960s, because the Arabs no longer have political power. They have wealth, they still have the land, they still have the titles, but they don't have political power. So they need me and you, who have origins in the hinterland, but are Muslims, have become Swahilis, to champion their interest in the politics of the town. So that's how that's how you can explain the Sumbas, the Muidaus, the Jahazis, and of course Kombo. And this is how I explain it in the PhD as well, in the thesis. Al-Qaumi, so again, same thing. It's people renegotiating or redefining their identity. In the 1920s in particular, this is when Swahili identity is really redefined. And if you look at the archival record of the debates, the letters people were writing to the colonial authorities explaining their history, their traditions, their origins, it's very interesting. Names were cobbled up of nowhere to describe peoples, so that the Swahilis never wanted to be described as Africans or as Nika. And therefore, Kauma, for example, the name like Al-Qaumi, which is actually quite noble in Islamic history, was adopted. There's Al-Kuf for Kilifi. So there are many of these examples, but this happens in the deep of the colonial period, when land is being redistributed, but also identities are being redefined. I hope that's actually not my right. Sorry about that. Race and Islam. There's a book by in fact, it was the first reference of the thesis. It's called Islam and Race, something like that, by Lewis, has written about this kind of Islamic intellectual traditions and sort of hierarchies. I wouldn't call them race. That's a contestable subject, but definitely putting people into hierarchies that are not negotiable, that are mutually exclusive, has been a thing that has existed in Islamic intellectual tradition. But also, as Mwalimu says, even in some Christian examples as well, you would find this. The point actually of the PhD also, one of the arguments I make is that racial thinking or racial thought is not a preserve of the West. In particular, associated with 19th century, what they used to call scientific racism, which has a Darwinian kind of origin. That is not the beginning of racial thinking. That actually was the kind of you can even say the intellectual agenda of my work, is to show that why is it that when it comes to Africa and we're thinking about identity, we only think ethnicity? Africans can imagine identity from so many ideological resources, including race, right? So this was the main kind of intellectual debate here, agenda of my work. So yeah, I mean, let's think more about that. There's also Marshall Hodgson's idea of the Islamicate, which is the kind of more broad and inclusive culture of Islam that involves everyone. He also talks about that. So that and Lewis's work, the kind of yeah. Yeah, I think I've already answered that. Sort of the the fluid, contextual, situational categories that existed, in medieval history in Mombasa, and how did that become static? I think you thought I was saying that these categories are very rigid and fluid, but actually what I said before that was they were not, but they were made to become very fluid and rigid in the colonial period, which is why post-colonial politics in Mombasa emerged the way they did, and until today. Now, the relationship between this sort of racialized discourse, I will just kind of put all these three questions from Mwalimu Gashi together. The relationship between this racialized discourse, has it produced a distinctive political culture, which then has been used to distinguish the coast and the rest of Kenya? I think basically, yeah. So, yes. So there's evidence, and it's just because I have to go through it, it takes time, but there's evidence in the 1950s from archival records of how this one actually was from James Mbotela, who was writing to the Robertson Commission, which had been sent to give to get evidence about whether the coast of the 10-mile strip should be separated from the rest of Kenya. And he told Robertson that the coastals are very different from upcountry Kenyans. That the coastals have culture. These are exactly, I wish I could actually just read the actual quote, but you say something along those lines, that the coastals have culture, they are peaceful, and that upcountry people are not. So there, and this is an argument that has been repeated over the years, in the way in which coastal people, when they forget their internal the categories, distinctions, whether we are Arab, Swahili, when we forget those things, when we call ourselves Wapwani, for example, this theme has always been there in the way that coastal people talk about upcountry Kenyans. But of course, at the heart of that is the extent of Christianization, of Westernization of education that happened in upcountry, which was taken to a predominantly Muslim town, and the reaction against that. This is really, I think, at the center. The fear for loss of jobs, the fear for loss of land is expressed in this language of these upcountry people should leave our place because actually they're not peaceful, they're not cultured, and they're not they're violent, they're thieves. All this theme has been very persistent since the 1950s. If you look at archival records or even newspaper records of fights within the dock workers union between people like Sami Omari and Dennis Akumu, the kind of debates they were having, it's the same, and they were young at the time, they were 25 or 24, but these are the debates they're already having at the time. So yes, especially during the Pwani Si Kenya discourse that was brought on by the Mombasa Republican Council, or so-called. Actually, you write about this, Mwalimu Gon and Justin Willis, talk about how when it comes to the idea that the coast has been marginalized by the central government and by extension upcountry Kenya, coastals are in argument. Whether you are Arab, whether you are Swahili, whether you are Mijikenda, we are in argument that we have been marginalized. But when it comes to how should we fix this marginalization on the coast, we are divided, because the Mijikenda will say the Arabs took our land, which is why in the argument here, or the conclusion was, there has never been a successful united coastal political project in post-colonial Kenya, because there are different registers of not only identity, but also of even how you read your own marginalization within the coast, right? So this racialized discourse actually plays against this calls for unity against the rest of Kenya. However, there is a narrative that has always existed that has distinguished the coast from the rest of Kenya. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ngala. Very interesting as you spoke. I remembered an interview I had with Councillor Alice Ekwe of Majengo. Yes, almost immediately after the 2002 elections, that led to the piece that I did in Francois Grignon and Marcel Rutten, the radical change in Movita. And as I was interviewing him, he reached a point and realized that I come from up country. And at that point, he said, you know, mtoto wa Kavirondo. Sasa angalia hapa pwani, tafuta msichana Mswahili ndio ustaarabike. So as you spoke, I remembered Councillor Sekuye very well at the time. Now we have a few online questions here. We have online questions here. Yes. Yeah, include Mwalimu Nyanchoga's question in the next round of questions. Dr. Nyanchoga asked a very interesting question, you know, about propaganda and the kind of stuff you were talking about. I remember it. Two questions online here on our chat. One is from one of our MIS students, Stephen Kapinde. This is what he says. Ngala, this was a very interesting presentation, although I logged in late. How do your work fit into Ali Mazrui's triple heritage with regard to identity negotiation? Now, the next question is, this is our presenter, immediate former presenter, good friend, Niels from Warwick. He has already left, so I'm sure he's in Warwick at the moment. He says, hi, Ngala. Thanks very much for this. I was wondering if you could quickly summarize in what core ways your racial viewpoint, quote unquote, is distinguished from the ethnic approach, since both are essentially constructed and negotiated categories. In what fundamental ways does your approach differ? If we have any other question online, if there is any other person who has a question, we give you a moment to unmute yourself and ask your question if you haven't written it on our chat. We want to proceed for the next 5 minutes because we lost a few minutes in the beginning. So if you have a question, please unmute yourself online and ask. Anybody from our online audience? I guess then there's no forthcoming question. So Wanangara, let me just ask a small question, if I may use this privilege of being or being the moderator for the afternoon. Now, the way I understood your work is really some kind of intersections of race, religion, and the state. And in race, I could think of Arabs, I could think of Indians, of course, Africans, and Europeans. You have spoken a lot about Arabs and Africans. Where are the Indians and local Mombasa Europeans in your dynamics of, you know, of analysis and the whole matrix of racial thinking? And then under religion, of course, Islam comes in automatically. You hinted at the influence of Christianity in this, but I was just thinking about chiasm. Is that a religious category? The chias, the local cultures, where are they in all this? And on the side of the state, of course, we think of Mombasa, you know, as an Arabic city-state, you know, for quite a long time. And then during colonial Kenya, it occupies this fairly ambiguous state of being, you know, geographically within the colony, but again, being part of the 9-mile coastal strip. And then, of course, we have Mombasa in Kenya's post-colony. Now, what I didn't hear a lot is how does these debates get influenced by the time Mombasa is occupying this ambiguous situation of being part of the coastal strip in Kenya geographically, but then politically somehow having some allegiance to Zanzibar and all that. Thank you very much. There is one last one here online from our student, Kefa Odembo. He says, this is incisive, Ngala. Your approach to the topic illuminates the crisis of citizenship in the nation state in Kenya, akin to Cote d'Ivoire tussle between the late Felix Houphouët-Boigny's community and Alassane Ouattara's ethnic base. I think that's just a comment. It's not a question. So you can answer that, and then we will want to end it there.
Mwalimu Njoga's question. I'm not an expert. Oh, he's left. I'm going to. Okay. I'm not an expert on propaganda, but I understood the concerns of the question, and which I also address. I mean, how much can you invent, really? I think that's the question. How much can you invent these identities and categories? And that question was addressed by what in history we call the limits of the invention school. So this huge debate began by, I believe, Ranger and Hobsbawm and their famous book, The Invention of Tradition, which then sparked this huge debate on the origin of African ethnicity. Is it something that's a given? If you're primordialists, is it something that's instrumentalized by politicians? If you're an instrumentalist, is it something that's constructed out of multiple sources, and is actually not a vestige from the African past, but actually really a product of the modern experience, right? So this kind of debates, especially in the 80s, and that's where you kind of jump into these limits of inventions. That invention, you can you can invent these identities, you can renegotiate them, you can redefine them, but they're always limits. They're limited by his history, first and foremost, because these identities don't come from thin air. For them to gain traction, for the idea of Kalenjin, for example, to gain traction, it wasn't just invented out of thin air because a radio journalist said the name on a radio station in the 1950s. It had to gain traction because it has alignment with history, with culture, with the idea of blood relationship, right? So all these are important even for the coast. No one could just wake up one day and say Mimi Mswahili and for that to be accepted. Like I said, there are qualifications. First, Islam is very important, right? So religion is very important. You almost have to be a Muslim. And then for the classical past, you have to be a landowner. You have to actually own land. You have to have Islamic erudition, moral piety, the way you speak. You have to be able to claim some claims of origin in the Middle East, in Shiraz, or in Persia, in Oman. These are the qualifications that no one, Mwalimu here could not go today dressed the way he's dressed and say I'm Swahili because everyone can say. There are qualifications that are rooted into the culture, to the history of the place, that will determine actually if that will gain traction or not. So those are the limits that are usually placed on this kind of invented categories, is how I would approach the question. How does this work fit into Ali Mazroui's triple heritage? Ali Mazroui's triple heritage, the way I understand it, is he's talking about the influences that came to the African continent. So from, I think he's talking about Arab culture, Islam, Christianity, and then our own, and sort of how the mixing, the intermixing, the clashing, the tension between those experiences gave rise to sort of the African post-colonial experience. Yes, you can do some parallels with my work. because I'm talking repeatedly about this historical tension that was produced in coastal society that has been enduring until today. Is Mombasa Arab or African? Is Mombasa Muslim or Christian? These are questions that have been asked for a century. And they inform the struggles to control the town's political institutions and therefore wealth and distribution of resources. Until today, these are questions that they may be asked in different languages, different ways, different periods, but really the fundamental question is, what is the basic identity of this city? And that is because of its geographical location within an intersection of, the Indian Ocean world and continental Africa. This is really kind of my conclusion, actually, in the research. Our friend from Warwick, I don't remember the name, but he has a very pertinent question. How is racial thought distinguished? Yeah, Mills. How is racial thought distinguished from ethnicity? This is actually the question when I was doing my Viva. I think it was one of 3 questions I was asked. And this one I had to go and read, actually. What am I actually saying? And I will actually just read out from the part where I explain what I mean here. So in examining racial modes of thought in Mombasa, this study has drawn from a body of work that has examined racial thought in Africa more widely. And here in particular, I'm referring to Mahmoud Mamdani's work on Rwanda, on the Rwandan genocide, and Jonathan Glassman's work on the Zanzibar riots that happened before the revolution. So their work has contributed, especially in expanding the study of race beyond the West. In this way, the study follows in the lines of conceptual reformulations that perceive of racial thought as a shifting field of discourse and approach the study of race as a topic of intellectual history rather than a doctrine synonymous with 19th century European science that categorizes and ranks humanity in specific biological terms. So that's kind of different from that. Since societies across space and time have often developed discourses that divide humankind in constant categories, each distinguished by inherited traits, for example, discourses of civilization and barbarism. The task of the researcher, these authors have suggested, is to examine how particular ways of categorizing humanity become important modes of organizing social and political action than others, and at a particular time and places. Associated with this conceptual framework is the argument that identity is socially constructed, and that racial identities, amongst other identities, including ethnicity, are constructed through intellectual work that attributes to them particular qualities, moral concerns, and behavior. What is also important to note is that while studies of African ethnicity have predominantly focused, this is where the difference really is for me. Studies of African ethnicity have predominantly focused on vertical and regional divisions between what were once thought of as tribes. For the students, especially undergraduate students here, of history, for me, I think one of the biggest aha moments when I joined the university was this demystifying of the idea of tribe. I think for me, that was the biggest intellectual moment, that actually these things that we've been told that we belong to, that we've been born into, are timeless, pristine, pure. They have never mingled with others. They have always existed. They will always exist. That idea being shattered for me was the biggest intellectual sort of evolution. Yeah. So that happens with ethnicity. But the way ethnicity was, John Iliff is a well-known, his work on Tanzania, when he talks about, say Africa had tribes. This is what the colonials thought, advised by the anthropologists, that Africans had tribes that were pristine, and each tribe had a chief and a structure of laws and a culture. But no tribe dominated the other. There was no hierarchical relationship, right? They were thought to exist in a, as I say here, vertical sort of relationship. But in places such as Rwanda now, as Mamdani shows, or Zanzibar, as Glassman shows, what happened there is that identities were imagined as hierarchical strata And they were linked to one another in a dominant and subordinate relationship that structured the entire society. So now when you talk about Tutsi or Hutu, there are so many examples to give there. So that's what I meant as the difference. And just to finish, so concepts convergent with the ideal of civilization, such as Ungwana or Ustarabu, ostensibly inclusive yet contributing to hierarchical beliefs and practices that look uncomfortably like racism, have also occurred not only in the intellectual traditions found along the East African coast, but in many other non-Western traditions as well. So this is why I distinguished sort of how identity has been imagined in Mombasa from not only many parts of Africa, but also many parts of Kenya as well. What are the others? I think you asked, where are the others? Where are the others? Where are the Indians? So you'll find also that my dissertation is named Town versus Hinterland. History of racial thought in Greater Mombasa. For me, I call them categories for a reason. Because they're categories of identity. Because I'm still leaving room there, dangerously as that may sound, for imagining whether these categories are racial or ethnic. But what they are is that they are categories of identity. And I talked more about their relationship, that the relationship has been hierarchical, based, of course, on how land has been distributed on the coast, and the fact that others were the idea of native and non-native, right? These categories were constructed, especially by colonial intellectual work and administrative work. So Indians, similar to Arabs, were designated as non-natives. So that means that they had the same privileges, they have the same access to resources as much as the Arabs do. And in fact, for Mombasa, most of them intermarried with the Arabs, sold land amongst each other. So they formed a strata there, Indians and Arabs, they formed a strata. And those Swahilis who were accepted as Arabs during the colonial period, they were part of the category that I refer here to as townspeople. You didn't ask about, did you ask about the Europeans? Of course, the Europeans are participants in this social milieu, but they are participants they are the ones who are actually administratively arranging the place, which is giving rise to these consequences of identity construction and all these things. So the main distinction actually for these categories for me is the idea of, are you from town? Are you from the hinterland? And then that determines your racial category and therefore the resources, the rights that you have access to. This is the kind of the history of the place. How did Mombasa become part of the protectorate? Very simple historical detail. I mean, it became, so the Sultan of Zanzibar, who becomes the political, what do you call, a political figure that negotiates with the British for the British entry into the region, and therefore declares Zanzibar and the hinterland, and the 10-mile, well, they say 10-mile strip of the Kenyan coast as his territory, as his personal territory, as he had stationed agents along the coast, from Kipini, to the border with Tanganyika. And of course, because of that, the treaty was signed. And that part, when the rest of British East Africa Protectorate was becoming Kenya colony in 1920, that part remained a protectorate until 1963. And Mombasa was part of it. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. Friends, we will end it here on that very, very high note. I now understand why Councillor Sekue was asking me to look around for a Swahili girl, but I did not succeed in that. I still remain mtoto wa Kavirondo, according to him. So, Mlungwana, please come and end this for us very quickly in 3 minutes because we have exceeded our time.
Ngala, thanks very much again for gracing this afternoon's staff seminar. I can't thank you enough because there is more actually we need to do. I've been telling my second-year students that there's quite a lot of history that needs to be done, And actually, Ngala has done the same. I think I've talked to them about these spaces that, history has to go back to. I did something similar, something that he has mentioned, and there's still more to be done. So on behalf of our chair and behalf of colleagues in the department and behalf of students and colleagues, the faculty of now the faculty has changed. I know for arts and social science. I want to extend again my gratitude and the gratitude of colleagues and everybody else that you're most welcome. And I want to echo the chair that we really look forward to owning you and becoming part of the department. So I hope that's going to work. Thank you, everybody, and let's meet next week, Thursday. Thank you very much. Thanks. Okay. Uh-huh. Okay. Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much for the heads up. Philip, take up. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.